Now, we shift gears, and this time we look at how we control resilience in an immunologist's point of view. The talk was originally supposed to be given by Professor Murtaugh, but he has to attend to personal concerns, so he sends his apologies. We found an equally suitable presenter for this topic, and he has no less than 27 years experience in the field, both in operations and in technical services. He is a diplomate of the European College of Porcine Health Management, and he is the Global Technical Team Leader for Boehringer Ingelheim Animal Health. Without further ado, to deliver the topic on how to control PRRS resilience in the eyes of an immunologist, Dr. Oliver Duran.
Thank you, Carlos. Good morning. I hope I can do justice to the presentation that was prepared by Professor Murtaugh. It's unfortunate that he's not here today. It's the first perspective he hasn't attended, and he personally told me to say hello to all his friends in Asia. So I will try and give you the view from the immunologist and try to explain how we in our day-to-day life can take some of these concepts and apply them in the control of PRRS. So better go the other way. No? Okay. So we start with the conclusions, I guess. I just need to make sure that that's correct. And what Professor Murtaugh wanted to do here is try to look at his understanding of the concept of resilience. So he, like I think all of us speakers, struggled a little bit with this concept. What are you guys asking me to talk about? Resilience. I'm an immunologist. Resilience sounds like something from a different field. Yeah? And so he found some of these descriptions, and these are used in psychology and used in human medicine to explain how people cope under difficult circumstances, maybe under a lot of stress, or maybe under situations where they're not in control. And that describes our feelings around PRRS quite often, particularly at the front line, at the farm level. But really, after thinking about it, he realized that what we were talking about is this concept of resilience within all the different parts of our business. So starting from the micro level, from the cellular level, all the way to the farm, system, and even country or area level. And what we're talking about from an immunologist standpoint, or even a virologist standpoint, is a difficult balance between a virus that wants to be resilient and mutates and recombines and adapts, and the pig and the humans that are trying to fight it, also trying to adapt to survive. And so there's these concepts at play here. Let's look a little bit about how the pig responds to these viral infections. We already heard from Professor Han-Chun Yang that this virus is very clever. It changes, it moves, and it escapes the immune system. But we also need to understand that disease in general and PRRS infection is not just an average. Within a population, you will see a lot of variation. You will see pigs responding to the same virus in very different ways. And this is an example here on the slide of studies conducted at University, Kansas State, and following animals from day 0 to day 42 after laboratory infection with the same virus, and how their weight gain evolved over time. What you can see is that same virus, same environment, huge difference in response. Some pigs appeared to be pretty much unaffected, while others were severely restricted in their growth, and some of them even went backwards. Some of them died. And you can see on the other graph the distribution of final weights at day 42. Most of the pigs were infected in this experiment. Only the black dots were uninfected. But look at the variation in weight impact. So we have this challenge and this opportunity, I guess, that not all pigs respond the same. So if we can manage this variation to our benefit, maybe we can start winning against this virus. So our challenge is to manage our pig herds, our animals, in a way that we reduce this variation and keep only that proportion of animals that are thriving. And that is resilience. That allows us to have healthy and productive pigs. To illustrate this a little bit further, let's dig a bit more deeply into these same animals. So this is data from the same big experiment. This time, on the graph, what we have is the virus load and the weight gain. And what we see is, again, the population, these pigs, the same conditions, similar genetics, respond very differently. And what we have in this top corner here is what we have, a population of pigs that are naturally suffering from high viremia, so the virus is successfully replicating, but they're still growing. So these are animals that somehow have developed an ability to cope with this virus. And in the literature, people talk about tolerance. Okay, somehow the body of these pigs, or the immune system of these pigs, has developed mechanisms to be infected but not suffering from the negative outcome of the disease. On the other hand, you've got this other population of animals that are growing very well, but have managed to also control the level of viremia. So in this case, their immune system is outperforming other pigs. And that's what we talk about resilience. The extreme, obviously, is these pigs that, where the virus can no longer replicate. But here, what we're talking about is animals that are able to respond better to the infection and overcome it and grow. So you can already see how complex this is when you look at, in a very controlled experiment, what a huge range of effects you have. I'm going to move this down. Professor Murta wanted to illustrate this a little bit better. So these are the results of, again, challenge experiments with different field strains of virus, pathogenic field strains. Strains that were isolated in clinical cases and then put into pigs in the respiratory challenge model. And there typically we evaluate lung lesions 14 days after infection. What you can see on this chart, so up here you have, this is the percent lung after 14 days, and these are the different viruses. And you have 10 pigs in each experiment. The cross means the pig died, and the number is the percent lung lesion. So high is bad, low is good. And what you can see within each virus challenge experiment is huge variation. So in this experiment here, just as an example, you've got 4 pigs that had no lesions, 0. And 1 pig with 58%, half the lungs affected pathologically by PRRS. And you can see across the experiments, the trend is similar. So again, if you think about it in a simplistic way, resilience or success would be to only have this bottom half of the population, this bottom half of pigs that for whatever reason are able to cope with the infection. And so Professor Murta is saying that, while we wait for some of these solutions that we'll hear more about, like genetic resistant pigs or the ideal pig PRRS vaccine, maybe we need to work with some of the conditions that we have already. He also wants to highlight the importance of what we call the herd immunity. And this has been very well studied in human medicine, and I think we're beginning to understand this in veterinary medicine. This is an example from human influenza, where they took populations of humans, 100 people, and measured their antibody titers. With influenza, unlike PRRS, antibody titers are very predictive of protection. As we'll hear later, we don't have that luxury with PRRS. But what you can see is the population was not the same. There was different titers. But what happened is that once the vaccination began, and it lasted for a long time, the population shifted upwards, shifted towards high antibody titers. And what that successfully did is move the whole herd immunity towards a plane of being protected. So with the influenza example, it's very clearly seen that by vaccinating the whole population, we reduce the unprotected animals or people, and reduce the opportunities for the virus to multiply and grow. And so the idea of this is that we need to consider that concept as one of the ways that we can reduce or increase resilience against PRRS. And this being Asia, Professor Murtaugh wanted to talk about the yin and the yang of PRRS infection, and he wanted to put the different elements that are in this scale. And this scale is on our farms every day. If it goes one way or another, the farm has clinical disease or healthy pigs. And this is actually what we mean by resilience. So on one side, we have disease variation, as I explained. So it doesn't always behave the same way. And then on the other side, we have resilience and tolerance, two mechanisms that the animal has to cope with the infection. Also, what we start to see here is that there is a lot of factors that affect the immune response and the ability of the animal to cope with this infection that are not directly related to the virus or directly related to the immunity that pig has, that specific immunity. And here's where we really start talking about innate immunity and other defense mechanisms that the pig has to prevent infections. We know that when you have disease stress, you will increase this variation that you find even in healthy and non-stressed pigs. Disease stress already will reduce growth, even if you don't have pathology. And then the other factor that's really important is that in the real world, we're not dealing with one infection. We're dealing with complex diseases which are mixtures of many different pathogens. In many cases, we have these low-level subclinical infections that are maybe even undetected, but are there changing this balance and influencing the outcome. And then finally, what we see is this clinical disease or this clinical infection, which then causes weight loss, mortality, coughing, or whatever. But underneath that, there's a lot of things going on that we don't really see with the naked eye. To illustrate this, again, Dr. Murtaugh goes towards the human infectious disease research. And in this case, it's an experiment that is looking at this tissue tolerance and the impact of co-infections. This is a paper published in Science, where they looked at two important respiratory diseases in humans, influenza A virus and Legionnaires, and both, which is a bacteria. Both of these on their own lead to mild disease, but if combined together, you have very, very severe respiratory infections which risk even death. The experiment was carried out in mice, so these are not people, these are mice. And what the data is trying to show is this impact of tissue tolerance. I'll try and explain this to you, and it's in the notes if I don't do a very good job. Number one, we've got the bacterial load on this graph here, okay? And that we count with colony-forming units, and obviously the higher the number, the more bacteria. What you can see is that even in co-infection, so influenza plus the bacteria, the number of bacteria is not increased. So the immune system in these mice is able to cope with the infection. So we don't have an immune tolerance, or we don't have an immune suppression. But when you look at lung lesions in these mice, you have influenza alone, that leads to some lung disease. Legionella alone, nothing. Those mice are healthy, or at least the lungs are healthy. When you co-infect them, you have much more severe disease and a higher average lung lesion score. So definitely those two infections, even though the bacterial number did not grow, are much more severe. And you see that then in the weight gain, the same pattern. When you have the co-infection, those mice grow slower. And so in this case, what we have is a decreased tolerance, a decreased ability for the lungs to cope with that infection, and we have increased sickness or severity of disease, while the immune system was still working fine. So if we extrapolate this example and think about our world, the world of pigs, there's a number of situations that we face every day on most of our farms that fit this pattern. And this is why it's so important when we control PRRS, when we think about PRRS control, we cannot forget about all the other infections. If you just focus on PRRS, you are probably not going to get the whole picture. This is some data that was collected in the United States based on clinical outbreaks on farms and calculating the differential impact in these finishing pigs on infections alone, monoinfections, mycoplasma, influenza, PRRS, versus the combinations. And then the cost or the loss in dollars per head that those diseases caused. And I know, Tom, you know this data very well, and you use it all the time. What Professor Murtaugh is trying to show here is that you can have mycoplasma cause some loss in performance, but typically these pigs are actually not clinically affected. So the pigs are mostly resilient. They're able to deal with that infection, not show a lot of clinical signs, not die, but not grow very well. The viruses cause more severe economic damage, and they are alone serious pathogens. But look at the difference when you now have these combined infections. So a pretty mild, not so serious infection with influenza, you lose the resilience, the ability of that pig to cope with either flu or mycoplasma, and you get severe disease. And the same with PRRS. So the disease together are not just 1 + 1 makes 2. In this case, 1 + 1 makes 5. So how can we deal with this? So Professor Murtaugh is saying, in the reality that we live, with the virus as it is, we need to look at a step-by-step approach. One easy step, again, is to go back to this herd immunity concept and say, if we properly immunize our whole herd, what we call in the BI world the whole herd approach, we can make a difference. To illustrate that, let's just look at a simple measure that we can use on the farm, which is ELISA. Again, it's not a measure of protection, but it does give you an idea of variation. So here we have the different dates that the samples were collected. And here we have the S to P ratios on the ELISA. And then we're using a box plot to illustrate this. One of our speakers later on will use this in their system. This gives you a much better measure than just looking at the average. And what you see is when you start mass vaccinating your breeding herd 4 times a year, you narrow down the variation. in that population. And that can only help ensure that all the animals are on the same level of immunity. We also know from many, many studies that the correct vaccine will reduce PRRS clinical disease. This is a collection of isolates from the United States that have been tested in the respiratory model for the effect of the vaccine. They're highly variable in terms of their genetic makeup, so these are very different viruses. And what's constant, the number changes, but in all of these studies there is a significant reduction in lung lesions. So in all of these cases, the vaccine, independent of genetics of the virus, was able to control the disease. Not 100%, but always to a significant level. The other interesting part of this data is that there was no correlation between the genetic difference to the vaccine and the level of protection. So you cannot predict if one vaccine is going to be better than another one looking at the genetics of the virus. And again, to follow up on our previous speaker, not all vaccines are created equal. And Professor Murtaugh talks about some of the critical factors that a vaccine must have to be successful. In his eyes, an attenuated modified live vaccine is the only way currently available to control PRRS with vaccines. Killed and subunit products do not protect. Attenuated modified live vaccines must be safe. This is a point that was already illustrated by our previous speaker. And also, as you know, in many farms in the United States in the past, field isolates were used to immunize the herd. And less people are doing that because you are actually generating more virus in the field and risking neighboring herds. And really that control method has not been successful. And finally, Professor Murtaugh believes good technical support is critical because how we use the vaccines is also very, very important. Again, Professor Murtaugh likes using this slide. There is plenty of products out there. There's many, many PRRS vaccines, but many of these are no good. Many of these do not benefit the pigs. And he uses this as just an illustration. This is an example of some subunit and vectored vaccines that were used in the United States. The paper was published by a veterinarian working for veterinary practice, and they compared these vaccines in breeding herds and looked at the output, the clinical outcome of those interventions in the field. So this is not a controlled experiment, it's a field experiment. And what you see here is the percent of sows and piglets affected, and then on this side, the number of days that the animals were off feed. The 4 treatments were control, so no challenge, not vaccinated, but infected, the 2 vaccine concepts, and then a modified live. And what you can see from the data is that both for the viremia measured by PCR, the number of piglets that were lost that did not wean from that farm, and the number of days that the sow was off feed following infection were very different and not showing any clinical benefit for those 2 vaccines. While the modified live vaccine performed very similarly to the animals that were not infected. But the vaccine is not perfect, and there are some limitations. Number 1, it only works against PRRS. So if your farm has influenza, or JESCI, classical swine fever, etc., the vaccine can only control what it says on the label. Therefore, diagnostics are critical. Diagnostics mean you can understand what are the diseases present on your farm in addition to PRRS. Also, you can use diagnostics to monitor how well you're doing. And we will have a lot of this in our expert panel session because there's a lot of questions in Asia around how to use diagnostics for PRRS monitoring. We also can say that it does not replace all of the things that we need to do properly on the farm: sanitation, the right genetics, and animal care. And all of these factors together, like Alain Villa showed in the first presentation, are what make a farm resilient. We don't have time to go into the diagnostics, but there's plenty of tools that we can use every day to monitor and diagnose PRRS, but some of them are more suited to laboratory or investigation purposes, while real-time PCR and the IDEX ELISA or another ELISA are good tools that we can use every day. So let's start to summarize the goals or the objectives that Professor Murtaugh had. And he calls these advanced swine production practices to enhance resilience. Our goal is to minimize the exposure, and we'll talk a lot about that in the next talks about minimizing exposure through biosecurity and good management. We maximize the immunity through vaccines that work, and we prevent infection by having good external biosecurity. Dr. Murtaugh suggests that the way to achieve that is to have multi-site, all-in, all-out production with unidirectional flow, where pigs never go backwards in your system. Dr. Gillespie will tell us a lot of his experiences with this in the real world. Artificial insemination with boars that are negative or naive to PRRS is critical for the long-term success of PRRS control, and PRRS-free replacement gills are also critical. As Professor Han-Chun Yang mentioned, until we have those, we can't really hope to be successful in PRRS control. And then all of this needs to be brought under the umbrella of a good, high-quality biosecurity program, of which we will hear more later on today. So, in conclusion, what can we do on the farm to enhance PRRS resilience? We can minimize our exposure by employing high biosecurity, good sanitation, and all-in, all-out production, not just for PRRS. Remember all these other infections that we have. Number two, maximize immunity with the effective use of a modified live vaccine that works. Number three, prevent or reduce the infections with good veterinary practice and good animal management, needle management, cross-fostering management, all of those things we'll hear about today. Number five, identify pathogens with quality diagnostics to make good decisions of your treatments. And number six, keep your records to understand the impact of what you have done. Understand that you've spent money on a program and you have an outcome. Is this going to be long-term successful to the prevention of disease? So, as you can see, we have quite a job ahead of us, and I'm very happy to say that a lot of the talks that follow me will go into a huge amount of detail around how we can achieve resilience every day. Thank you.